This video will provide an overview of the anatomy and physiology of the respiratory system, and it's intended to supplement any coursework assigned by your instructor. The objectives for this learning module include discuss the A&P of the respiratory system, discuss lung volume and dead space, differentiate ventilation, oxygenation, and respiration, describe the process of gas exchange in the alveoli, explain how oxygen and carbon dioxide are transported in the blood, discuss the mechanisms that regulate breathing, describe the concept of hypoxic drive, and explain how the level of CO2 and pH of the blood relate to ventilation. The primary function of the respiratory system is to move air in and out of the body and to exchange carbon dioxide waste for oxygen. The respiratory system is also responsible for filtering particles out of the air and for trapping foreign microorganisms in mucus and removing them from the body. The respiratory system is a primary regulator of pH in the body, enables us to speak, and is responsible for our sense of smell. Before we go any further, we need to clarify some terminology that may sometimes be used interchangeably by medical professionals. Ventilation is the physical act of moving air in and out of the lungs. There are two phases of ventilation, inhalation and exhalation. Respiration is the gas exchange process of oxygen and carbon dioxide. Oxygenation is the process of loading oxygen onto hemoglobin molecules in the red blood cells. The upper airway functions to warm, filter, and humidify air as it enters through the nose and mouth. Air enters the nasal cavity and passes into the nasopharynx at the rear of the nasal cavity. Air entering the mouth travels through the oral cavity to the oropharynx, which acts as a passage for both air and food. The posterior portion of the oropharynx has a rich supply of nerves that can stimulate the gag reflex, which serves as a protective mechanism to prevent anything but air from entering the lower airway. The oral and nasal cavities are separated by the palate, which consists of the anterior hard palate and posterior soft palate. The laryngopharynx lies below the oropharynx and extends from the epiglottis to the entrance of the trachea or windpipe. Since both food and air can be present in the oropharynx and laryngopharynx, the epiglottis closes during swallowing. Food is diverted into the esophagus or food tube. The larynx joins the pharynx to the trachea to facilitate air passage into the lower airway, to act as a sphincter to prevent solids and liquids from entering the lower airway, and contains the vocal cords that produce speech. From the larynx or voice box, the air continues down the trachea to the carina, where the trachea divides into the right and left mainstem bronchi. The mainstem bronchi branch into smaller secondary bronchi, which turn into smaller bronchioles, which divide into smaller alveolar ducts that lead to the alveoli. The alveoli look like clusters of grapes where each individual sac is called an alveolus. It is at this level that gas exchange takes place. In this image, we see an alveolus on the right that has been magnified to illustrate how gas exchange takes place. Each alveolus has a thin wall that consists of a single layer of tissue. As the alveolus expands, this wall becomes even thinner, which allows the gas exchange to take place between the pulmonary capillaries and the alveolus. Carbon dioxide diffuses out of the bloodstream to be exhaled from the body, and the inhaled oxygen molecules enter the bloodstream and attach to the hemoglobin on the red blood cells. This process is called external respiration because we are exchanging oxygen and CO2 with the external environment. Internal respiration occurs when oxygen and CO2 are exchanged with the cells inside the body. The alveoli contain pulmonary surfactant that reduces surface tension, improves pulmonary compliance, and prevents atelectasis or alveolar collapse. We know that blood carries oxygen to the body's cells and returns CO2 to the lungs to be exhaled. While a small amount of oxygen dissolves in the blood, it's only about 1.5%. The remainder of oxygen is transported bound to hemoglobin molecules, which are bound to red blood cells. Each hemoglobin molecule can carry 4 oxygen molecules. The image on the left illustrates the 4 oxygen binding sites on a hemoglobin molecule. There are 3 ways carbon dioxide is transported in the blood. 10% is dissolved in the blood plasma, 70% is dissolved in plasma as bicarbonate, and 20% is transported by the red blood cells bound to hemoglobin. Our body's oxygen needs are constantly changing. To accommodate these needs, our body has a series of receptors and feedback loops that monitor gas concentrations and send messages to the brainstem to adjust ventilation rate and depth. As levels of CO2 in the blood increase, this signals the breathing muscles to contract and take a breath. This is an involuntary process. In patients who regularly retain CO2 due to conditions such as chronic obstructive pulmonary disease or COPD, their stimulus to take a breath can change to low levels of oxygen detected in the blood. This is called hypoxic drive. Inhalation is governed by Boyle's law, which states that the pressure of a gas is inversely proportional to its volume. This concept is illustrated in the image on the left. As air volume in the container increases, the pressure within the container decreases. If the top of the container is pushed down, the volume of air in the container is decreased, but the pressure increases. Gases like to equalize their pressure in two areas that are connected. A gas will tend to move from an area of higher pressure to an area of lower pressure in an attempt to equalize the pressure in the two areas. During inhalation, also called inspiration, the dome-shaped diaphragm muscle that separates the chest and abdominal cavity contracts and flattens out, causing the rib cage to enlarge from top to bottom. Additionally, the intercostal muscles located between the ribs contract, moving the ribs upward and outward. Combined, these muscle contractions cause an increase in the chest cavity, thus decreasing intrathoracic pressure. As a result, the atmospheric pressure outside is higher, which creates a slight vacuum that pulls the atmospheric air into the respiratory system. As the diaphragm and intercostal muscles relax, the air volume in the lungs is compressed and the intrathoracic pressure increases to a point that is higher than the external atmospheric pressure, and air is exhaled or expired from the lungs. Inhalation is an active process, meaning it requires energy for the muscles to contract. Exhalation is a passive process that does not require energy because the muscles are relaxing back to their normal resting position. Respiratory volume is the term used for the different volumes of air moved by or associated with the lungs at any given point in the respiratory cycle. There are four major types of respiratory volumes. Tidal volume is the amount of air that enters the lungs in a normal ventilation. An adult tidal volume runs approximately 500 milliliters and is indicated in yellow in the image on the left. Expiratory reserve volume is the amount of air that an adult can forcefully exhale past a normal tidal exhalation. This can be as much as 1,000 to 1,200 mLs in an adult. This is indicated in green on the image on the left. Inspiratory reserve volume is the extra volume of air that can be inhaled during a deep inhalation and is indicated in orange on the image on the left. This volume ranges from 2,100 to 3,200 mLs in an adult. And the residual volume is the volume of air that remains in the lungs after exhaling as forcefully as possible. This volume is approximately 1,200 mLs and is indicated in purple in the image on the left. The residual volume keeps the alveoli open. An important concept to grasp is anatomic dead space, which is the air that is present in the respiratory system that never participates in gas exchange or respiration. If we look at the image on the right, none of the upper or lower airway passages illustrated here are involved in respiration. The anatomic dead space includes the oral and nasal cavity all the way down to the terminal bronchioles. This is all anatomic dead space, which is approximately 1 ml per pound of body weight. It is for this reason that we need to use a bag valve mask that provides more than twice the 500 ml tidal volume to effectively ventilate a patient who is not breathing. Physiologic dead space includes alveoli that cannot participate in respiration because they are damaged or collapsed. Gas molecules exert force on the surfaces with which they are in contact. This force is called pressure. Gases are normally present as a mixture of different types of molecules. For example, the atmosphere consists of oxygen, nitrogen, carbon dioxide, and other gaseous molecules. And this mixture exerts a certain pressure called the atmospheric pressure, which is 760 millimeters of mercury at sea level. Partial pressure is the pressure of a single type of gas in a mixture of gas. For example, in the atmosphere, oxygen exerts a partial pressure of 159 millimeters of mercury, and nitrogen exerts another partial pressure of 593. Dalton's law states that the total pressure exerted is equal to the sum of the partial pressures of the individual gases. Henry's law states that the concentration of a gas in a liquid, such as blood, is directly proportional to the solubility and partial pressure of the gas. So, the greater the partial pressure of the gas, the greater the number of gas molecules that will dissolve in the liquid. Diffusion is when gases will move from an area where its partial pressure is higher to an area where its partial pressure is lower in an attempt to equalize the partial pressure in both areas. The greater the difference in partial pressures, the more rapidly the gases will move. So what does all this have to do with breathing? So inhaled air typically has a partial pressure of oxygen near 160 millimeters of mercury. In the alveoli, the partial pressure of oxygen typically equilibrates at about 105. The blood coming from the pulmonary artery is lower in oxygen with a typical partial pressure of 40. This provides a difference in partial pressures for oxygen to diffuse from the alveoli into the capillary. Diffusion will occur along the length of the pulmonary capillary until the partial pressures come into equilibrium near 105 millimeters of mercury. The functioning of the partial pressure gradient for carbon dioxide works in reverse of what we just described for oxygen, with carbon dioxide partial pressure being higher in the pulmonary arterial blood than in the alveoli. So to summarize, external respiration occurs as a function of partial pressure differences in oxygen and carbon dioxide between the alveoli and the blood in the pulmonary capillaries. Internal respiration also occurs as simple diffusion due to partial pressure gradients. The partial pressure of oxygen in tissue is low, and the partial pressure of oxygen in the blood is higher. This creates a pressure gradient that causes oxygen to dissociate from the hemoglobin, diffuse out of the blood, cross the interstitial space, and enter the tissue. The control system that regulates involuntary breathing is made up of three components: the respiratory control center, effectors, and sensors. The respiratory control center in the brain consists of three distinct neuronal groups: the dorsal respiratory group and the ventral respiratory group, both located in the medulla, and the pontine respiratory group located in the pons. Collectively, these respiratory groups collaborate to maintain the rhythmic and coordinated pattern of breathing while also allowing for adjustments to accommodate varying oxygen and carbon dioxide levels in the blood and adapt to different metabolic demands. Control of breathing involves a complex system of receptors that monitor the levels of CO2, oxygen, and hydrogen ions, or pH, in the blood. These receptors include chemoreceptors that monitor concentrations of chemicals such as CO2, O2, and pH in the blood, both centrally in the brain and brainstem, and peripherally in the carotid arteries and the aortic arch, and the mechanoreceptors that are located in the chest wall, lungs, trachea, and pulmonary vessels, which provide sensory information to the respiratory center in the brain with regards to lung volume and airway stretch. When the concentration of CO2 increases, leading to a decrease in blood pH or acidosis, the chemoreceptors are stimulated. This results in an increase in the rate and depth of breathing. This response is essential for exhaling excess CO2 from the body and restoring the blood's pH to a more balanced state. Removal of carbon dioxide from the blood helps to reduce hydrogen ions, thus increasing systemic pH. On the other hand, a decrease in CO2 concentration and a rise in blood pH or alkalosis leads to a decrease in the rate and depth of breathing, allowing CO2 to accumulate to appropriate levels. Chemical control of ventilation also depends upon the body's need for oxygen. Peripheral chemoreceptors sense variations in arterial oxygen levels. When oxygen levels drop, as in situations such as high altitude environments or respiratory diseases, these chemoreceptors stimulate the respiratory control centers to increase ventilation. This promotes greater oxygen intake, thereby ensuring the vital tissues and organs receive the oxygen they require. The third component of the respiratory control system is the effectors, which are the respiratory muscles whose activity is directed by the control centers, resulting in the muscle contraction and relaxation of breathing. This brings us to the end of this presentation. Here we see the learning objectives for this module. Can you demonstrate each of these objectives? If not, consider going back to review any content that you struggled with. Thank you for watching this learning material.